They're angry, they're armed, and they think they've stayed at home long enough. Protesters in the US are seething over being forced to self-isolate and shelter in place. Are these rallies to reopen dangerously misguided or democratically legitimate? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmakers are America's anti-lockdown protests. COVID-19 has killed far more people in the United States than anywhere else in the world. But protesters in several states are demanding the lockdowns be lifted. More than 30 million Americans have lost their jobs as businesses slash staff or go bankrupt. State authorities are adamant that staying home is essential for saving lives. But the thousands of demonstrators either don't believe it or they think the tough measures come at too great a cost to their liberty. Now, even though many of these protesters are armed to the teeth, they're still just a noisy minority. But as Haider Abbasi reports, they often find support from the nation's most powerful man.
Storming the State House, hundreds of protesters entered Michigan's state capitol, violating stay-at-home orders. They want an end to the lockdown imposed because of COVID-19. Unusually, members of a militia joined the rally. Politicians inside the building were debating whether to extend emergency powers given to Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. She ordered the lockdown in March. Her state has one of the highest infection rates in the country, with more than 47,000 cases and 4,500 deaths. Those alarming facts haven't deterred these protesters who want businesses reopened. But it's not just about the economy. This is a fringe group that believes their liberty is being taken from them and that the novel coronavirus is a political hoax. And they have a powerful supporter, the President of the United States. In response to the armed protest, Donald Trump tweeted, "The governor of Michigan should give a little and put out the fire. These are very good people, but they are angry. They want their lives back again, safely." Like the demonstrators in Michigan, the president is also keen to restart the economy. Since lockdowns began 6 weeks ago, 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. That's the highest jobless rate since the Great Depression. And with a presidential election due in November, it seems Trump is desperate for things to get back to normal as soon as possible. But it's hard to see how we can turn this around. More than 80,000 Americans have died from COVID-19, by far the highest death toll in the world. Will anti-lockdown protests increase as more people lose their livelihoods? And is there a risk they could become more violent? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Clovis, South Carolina, is Eddie Scarry. He's a columnist for the Washington Examiner and author of Privileged Victims: How America's Culture Fascists Hijacked the Country and Elevated Its Worst People. And Devin Burghart is in Seattle. He's the president of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights and an expert on white supremacy. Gentlemen, good to have you both on the Newsmakers. Eddie, do you support the demonstrators?
I think that they're perfectly legitimate, I think was what the word was used in the package you just aired. Not only are they legitimate, they're necessary. People are losing their livelihoods by the millions at this point. And not only that, you obviously have the government doing what it can to offer relief to a lot of these people, to the country, and yet it's not coming fast enough and it's not enough. The only way out of this now is to kind of get things moving, get things back to business as usual. Obviously, people have to take precautions, health precautions, but no, there's a lot of economic loss out there. People can't feed their families, so of course it's not only legitimate, but it's necessary.
Devin Burghart, legitimate and necessary. I'm assuming you disagree.
Problematic and dangerous. We've been tracking these protests since they broke out. We're currently tracking around 570 different protest groups, which now have around 2.2 million members across the country. While that is a large number and certainly concerning given the presence of armed militia groups and whatnot in their ranks, what it's shown to us organizationally is, number one, that this has really become a pipeline to more insidious far-right ideas. Secondly, that it's led to the spread of dangerous conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking. And thirdly, and most concerning, is how these protests and these protesters have demonized, attacked, and targeted heroes that are fighting against the virus. Doctors, nurses, law enforcement personnel, folks who are putting themselves on the line to make sure that we're safe and we can come through this together. Those are the folks who are being most threatened by this protest. It is important to remember that it's not just about our liberty, but, in the Declaration of Independence, it's that life comes before liberty. And if we're not looking at the entire picture, we're not paying attention to the science. If we're not paying attention, to what we should do in a crisis, the situation could get dramatically worse than it is today.
Eddie Scarry, why are so many of them dressed up as if they're about to invade Fallujah?
I don't know who you're talking about. I saw some pictures there where people had guns, as is their right. But no, I think that they are alarmed by the policymakers who are saying this is indefinite. And if it's not indefinite, we're not ready to go back. We can't tell you when. And when we do go back, it's not going to be what it was. They're telling you you can't work. If you want to work, you are selfish. You're threatening others. You're putting other people in danger. You're putting their health at risk. Well, you know what? This is going to spread. The virus is going to spread. There are going to be more infections. There is going to be some amount of death. We've seen that. And yet the science is clear that that the virus, by and large, everyone's going to be fine. By and large, the vast majority of people recover from this with no problems. That's exactly what Dr. Fauci said yesterday at the hearing on Capitol Hill. And yet these are the people who are protesting. They're the ones described as anti-science, the ones who are putting people at risk. Well, no, they simply looked at the science. They understand the virus probably more than other people. The people who are
but Eddie, we've also seen
urging a lockdown
we haven't just seen
indefinite.
Eddie,
they're the ones who are denying the science.
Eddie, we haven't just seen one or two. We've seen multiple placards showing an anti-vaxxer mentality as well, right? That's not pro-science. So that's
well, you also
called
called them fringe. So is it a fringe group or is this some widespread thing? Are they fringe or are they widespread? Because it can't be both.
Well, you could be widespread but believe fringe things, yes? A lot of people can believe stupid things. History tells us.
A lot of people can believe stupid things, but if you're going to dismiss them as a fringe group, why does it matter that you saw 2 or 3
we've
or,
asked the question.
or 10 people?
Well, we've asked the question. This is the thing.
Sign?
Okay, let me put it to you then, Eddie. The University of Chicago Divinity School and AP had a poll recently. They found 55% of Americans that were polled were against these protests. Does that mean anything to you? Does that help maybe put this into context to show that the majority of Americans are not so sure about these protests?
That it's 55%. If that's the majority, okay, that's fine. You still have then what? You have
55% is a majority.
Right, and then you have 50% who say we should be going back to work. And by the way, that transcends racial lines. When you look at the New York Times, their poll had about 20% of any race, Hispanic, Black, white, who said the lockdown has gone too far, the measures are too extreme. When you have that kind of cross-section of people, I don't care if it's 10%, 15%, that matters. It's not really a fringe group.
Okay, but again, I think there's a straw man here because we've asked if this is fringe. Nobody said for certain that this is fringe. This is why we're having this discussion, right, Eddie?
The news package you just aired said it was a fringe group.
Eddie, I've not said it's a fringe group. We're asking if this is fringe or representative.
Whoever it was.
Okay, let's go to Devin Burghart. Devin Burghart, there's a big question about liberty here. There's a big question about, and one of the reasons I asked about those guys who are sort of armed to the teeth as well, is there seems to be this kind of slippery slope mentality as well. It's like they're telling us to stay home, and someday they're going to want to take away our guns as well and take away our liberty and our freedom as well. Tell me why this comes as an entire package to a lot of these protesters.
Well, because there's been a movement that's been pushing those kind of ideas to the larger public for a while. The militia movement has been promoting these kind of insidious conspiracy theories and kind of incubating them for a while. They've just now found a major pipeline to move these ideas from the margins into the mainstream. And the idea that these militia groups are somehow on the fringe of this larger reopen movement, I think is a mistake. Mr. Scarry said that he's only seen a few pictures of them. But at the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, we've documented more than 120 different protests and protesters around the country where these reopen groups have been infiltrated by these militia groups. And already as a result of this kind of organizing, we've had 2 significant arrests of domestic terror attacks. In Missouri, an individual who was concerned about the lockdown orders decided that he was going to try to build bombs to blow up a hospital that housed COVID-19 patients. On May 1st, one of the organizers of one of these protests in Colorado was arrested for possessing pipe bombs and was a believer in the idea that it was time to kick off a second civil war, or what they're calling the Boogaloo. These things are not a mere rump to this larger movement. They have winnowed their way into the core of it, and they're driving a lot of the animus and the anger within it, and they're filling it with these ideas around civil war and violent conflict that are certainly not beneficial towards moving us to finding a way out of our current situation.
Eddie, those insurrectionist types and those specific examples that Devin has given, are those rotten apples? Are those the fringe within this group then?
It looks like it. I mean, if the point is to say that these protests are somehow not related to the lockdown, or to say that by and large they more have to do with racism, Nazism, that's just not the case. They are protesting the lockdowns. We've seen this across the country. What they're saying is, you can't keep us locked up and tell us we can't go back to work. But that's exactly what this segment is doing, is basically saying anyone who believes that the measures have gone too far, anyone who says that it's time, I think that it's time for us to go back to some sense of normal. It's time. I'd like to go back to work. I'd like to feed my family. Well, we're going to dismiss you as a fringe conspiracy theorist. We're going to dismiss you as someone who's anti-science, someone who wants to put the health at risk of others. That's what we're seeing now. That's what this has become.
Devin, do you understand that whatever the makeup of the people on the streets, however many pictures we see of people you don't like and banners and placards of things we don't like to hear, that states are working with a very limited window here, that the longer the lockdown continues, the more likely it's going to be that people are going to go out onto the streets because they're frustrated. They're not getting good leadership, whether at a federal level or a state level, and they want to go out and earn money again.
Well, certainly, I can definitely understand the pain and the suffering that people are going through during this lockdown. It's hard on all of us. I think that it would be a dramatic mistake, really harmful, if we prematurely open up the country and have to go back into a second period of lockdown. That'll be devastating, not only to the psyche of the American public, but to the economy that our other guest is so concerned about. It would be devastating. So that's why, we talk about making sure we're listening to the science. We're paying attention to what's going on the ground. And we're trying to find solutions that work for everyone, not just
and the more you listen to the science,
we're not going to be guided by conspiracies.
The less afraid you actually are, and the more eager you are to actually get back to some sense of normal. The more science you actually get, the less afraid you are. And when you say the word, we should be worried about opening premature. When is it mature? Tell us when mature is.
I also understand the importance of making sure that more people don't die. I don't know about you, Mr. Scarry, but I know a lot of people who've been infected with this disease, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. It is devastating, both to people's lives and to their future.
No one's arguing that it's not.
Well, then let's make sure that we're taking every precaution we can to make sure
people are doing that. But what is they're not. You said that you don't want to open when it's premature. Well, when is it mature? What would mature look like to you?
When scientists and epidemiologists tell us that we have bent the curve and that we're making it safe for us to continue doing the daily routines that we're so used to.
Eddie Scarry.
We have done that.
Okay, Eddie, just to get to the crux of this, right? A lot of the scientists, from Fauci to others, have said that this lockdown or semi-lockdown, and it's differed from state to state, city to city, this has mitigated the effects of this virus. And yes, 83,000 people have died. A lot more people would have died if these actions had not been taken over the past 2 months. Do you accept that and believe that?
Absolutely. And I think for a time period, it was absolutely necessary that we do everything that we could as a nation to limit the spread. The whole purpose of it was to make sure that our healthcare system didn't collapse under the weight of new cases, new deaths. But we've seen that we extended it twice. I think we're going on 2 months now, if not more, for some people. But the thing is, we're very lucky about what we know about this virus. Obviously, there's a lot that we don't know, but we are lucky in the sense we know that it tends to target older people. It targets people who have underlying conditions. It targets regions that are densely populated. The fact that we know that means that we can devote resources to those areas, to those people, protecting those people, and then the vast majority of us can move on with proper precautions, which is washing your hands, wearing a mask.
Devin, is that reasonable to you?
Actually, it's not. I think first of all, there's a callous disregard for human life embedded in that statement. And I think more importantly, that's not what the science is telling us, because we know that the coronavirus doesn't obey boundaries. It doesn't limit itself to geographic areas. It spreads by infection through individuals getting next to one another. So the science is not telling us that that's the appropriate approach. I think we need to do our best to listen to the scientists and epidemiologists on this, who have a much better handle on it than folks who aren't scientists and are promoting conspiracy theories and trying to argue that this is a hoax and have been wrong at each and every turn.
But to be clear, Eddie has not promoted a conspiracy theory during this segment.
That's
and
fine.
I've appreciated the fact that you've both taken the time to talk to us here on the Newsmakers. It's been really good. Thank you very much. Eddie Scarry and Devin Burghart, thanks for joining us. Now, protests against lockdowns haven't sprung up in many places around the world. So what is it about the United States that meant they emerged over there and they're so contentious over there? Let's take a deeper look now at America's unique responses to the coronavirus outbreak with David and Betsy Quammen. David is the author of Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic. And his wife, Betsy, is an environmental historian who's written about American militia and religious communities. Really good to have you both on the Newsmakers. And as you heard in the previous segment, we encourage debate. We even encourage debate even if you're in the same household. So, you know, don't be too polite. I want to start with Betsy Gaines Quammen here, because based on what we heard over the preceding 10, 15 minutes, what makes America so special when it comes to this? Why is America so exceptional when it comes to this type of debate, that it becomes a liberty versus slavery debate, or whatever it is to the protesters? Betsy?
I have probably two comments on that. I think that there is the issue of the constitutionality of these lockdowns. People feel like their liberties are at stake, and they believe that there is, and I guess that goes back to my second point. The second point that makes America so exceptional is this proliferation of conspiracy. So there's conspiracy that the Constitution is at stake and that these lockdowns are meant to take away individual liberties, because the idea that the COVID-19 is a hoax has come from so many different levels, from the federal level and then all through social media. So we're in a strange situation in the United States that we're so devoted to this idea of individual liberty, and we've also been very much misled by the information that we've been given, and this is proliferated on social media. So people really do think there's nothing to fear.
And so, David, then the science becomes politicized, and the science gets thrust into the culture wars. Is that to the detriment of public health?
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. We have here a very difficult, complicated conversation that we have to have between the concerns of public health and the concerns of civil liberties. And we hope that that conversation will proceed in a in a reasonable civil manner. I certainly share concern for the people who are stuck at home, unable to go to their jobs, unable to earn a living. It's very difficult. We appreciate that. I also share a respect for people's right to protest. In 1969, I was marching in the streets of Washington with hundreds of thousands of others protesting the war in Vietnam. And some of those were veterans of the Vietnam War, such as former Senator John Kerry and my dear friend Bill Chickering, who was an ex-Green Beret. But when veterans joined us to protest against the war, they didn't carry AR-15s. They didn't say, look, I have a gun. They said, I'm out in the streets to express myself. And so I wish that these protests were proceeding in that way so that we could have this complex discussion about how to balance public health with the genuine concerns of civil liberties.
Well,
Betsy,
and I would
yeah, what is it about the guns, Betsy? Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I mean, I asked Eddie about the guns and he deflected it, right? But it's just mind-boggling. This is about a virus. This is about a pandemic. Why are these guys going to the Capitol with their AR-15s?
They are going to the Capitals with their AR-15s because this issue has been conflated with the Second Amendment. That, again, people think their liberties are being taken away with this lockdown. And so in order to sort of further make their points in the protests, they're bringing guns so that their Second Amendment constitutional rights are very much evident and in the face of the public. Americans have a lot of guns and they bring them to protests, and it's incredibly dangerous.
David, should we have seen this coming based on the science?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are certain people, including our president, who have said things like, nobody saw this coming. Well, no. I mean, I published my book back in 2012. I talked to a lot of very shrewd scientists, and I asked them, will there be a next big one, a next big pandemic? And they said to me, yes, there will be. It'll be caused by a virus. That virus will come from a wild animal, possibly a bat, where, well, possibly in a wet market in a place such as China. What kind of a virus? Well, one that evolves quickly, maybe an influenza, maybe a coronavirus. This was known. All of these elements were there. Scientists were speaking to public health officials. Public health officials got it, but then top leadership rejected those warnings, particularly this top leadership, because it seemed a little bit more expensive to spend money on preparedness than not to. But the expense of preparedness was nothing compared to the financial losses as well as the human losses that we're suffering now.
And Betsy, if we're having this discussion about people feeling that their rights are being taken away, and for them they conflate a lot of these issues, a lot of experts, a lot of scientists have said, well, at the genesis of all of this, we should have seen this coming and that we might have to change our ways to prevent this from happening again. With all of that in mind, is it ever likely that Americans will be able to change their ways, given how emotive this all is when people question our way of life?
I'm really concerned about that because another American layer is this anti-science culture. There is such a mistrust in terms of information that's coming out. People don't have faith in Dr. Fauci, who's been very honest on these issues and very forthright, because his information is often undercut by our president. And so we have a culture right now that's inherently mistrustful of the government, and they also do not have very much faith in science. And we have a leader who continues to undercut important information. And not only that, the president tweeted out to his followers, liberate Virginia, liberate Michigan. He was calling on people to protest. So people think they're getting separate messages from the president and that he's telling the truth and that they do not have to listen to the other experts out there.
David, how do we revive science literacy and how do we revive people trusting in the experts again?
You know, they say that science proceeds one funeral at a time. And that means that it's hard to change the opinions of older people, established scientists. That's true in the public too. I think the answer is we need really good science education in the schools. We need education about aspects of science, including evolutionary biology, in the schools, not kept from the schools because of religious objections to it. We need to educate young people, grade schoolers, high schoolers in science, as well as in the humanities, so that as they come up, they will understand that rational decision-making and good governments, protection of public health, all of those depend on a faith in science and an understanding, some understanding of the principles of the process of knowledge acquisition that we call science.
David Quammen and Betsy Quammen, it's been a pleasure talking to you both here on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. Well, we're out of time. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.